Housewife's confession, the love I learned amid the daily chaos. In the quiet suburbs of Millbrook, Connecticut, Sarah Mitchell appears to have the perfect American dream, a successful lawyer husband, 2 bright children, and a pristine colonial home. But beneath the surface of her carefully curated Instagram posts and PTA meetings, Sarah is drowning in the relentless demands of modern motherhood and marriage. When a chance encounter with Maria, an elderly immigrant neighbor, begins to unravel the facade she's built around her life, Sarah must confront the truth about what love really means, not just the romantic kind, but the love for oneself, family, and the imperfect beauty of everyday life. This is a story of rediscovery, authentic connection, and finding joy in the chaos that defines us all. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or overwhelmed in your own home, you're not alone. This channel is a safe place for every woman who's lived through love, heartbreak, and the silent battles of family life. Subscribe now, and let's share our stories together, because your voice matters here. Chapter 1. The Perfect Storm. The alarm pierced through Sarah Mitchell's dreams at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before it was supposed to ring. She'd been awake anyway, her mind already racing through the day's impossible schedule like a broken record player stuck on the same overwhelming song. "Mom!" 8-year-old Emma's voice carried down the hallway of their colonial home in Millbrook, Connecticut, sharp with the particular urgency that only children could muster over something as trivial as a missing sock. Sarah's feet hit the cold hardwood floor before her husband David even stirred beside her. 34 years old, and already she felt like she was running a marathon every single day, except the finish line kept moving further away. The October morning air carried the crisp promise of another picture-perfect Connecticut fall day. Through their bedroom window, she could see the neighbor's maple tree dropping its amber leaves onto their immaculate lawn, another item for her mental to-do list that seemed to write itself in permanent ink. "Coming, honey," Sarah called back, her voice carrying that practiced cheerfulness she'd perfected over years of motherhood. She pulled on her favorite grey cardigan, the one with the small hole near the left elbow that she kept meaning to fix, but never found time for. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with the familiar chaos of a Tuesday morning. Emma sat at the breakfast bar, her dark hair wild from sleep, frantically digging through her backpack with the determination of an archaeologist. "I can't find my permission slip for the field trip," Emma announced, her brown eyes, so much like David's, beginning to well with tears. "Mrs. Henderson said if we don't turn it in today, we can't go to the Science Museum." Sarah's stomach tightened. The permission slip was somewhere in the pile of papers on the kitchen counter, buried beneath David's case files, her own grocery lists, and the endless stream of school communications that seemed to multiply like rabbits. "Don't worry, sweetheart, we'll find it," Sarah assured her daughter, already moving toward the coffee maker. The machine gurgled to life, promising the caffeine salvation that would carry her through at least the first few hours of the day. 12-year-old Jake shuffled into the kitchen, wearing yesterday's jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt that proclaimed him a gaming legend in fluorescent green letters. His sandy hair stuck up at impossible angles, and he moved with the particular lethargy of a preteen who considered mornings a personal affront to his existence. "Mom, can you drive me to school today? Tyler's mom said she'd pick us up after for basketball practice, and I don't want to take the bus." "Jake, honey, I have that presentation at work today, remember? The Henderson account." Sarah poured coffee into her favorite mug, a chipped ceramic piece Emma had made in second-grade art class that read, "World's Best Mom," in crooked blue letters. The coffee was bitter, but she drank it anyway, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She'd been working part-time as a marketing consultant for 3 years now, trying to maintain some sense of professional identity while being present for her family. Most days, she felt like she was failing at both. David appeared in the doorway, adjusting his navy tie with practiced precision. At 36, he still looked like the ambitious law student she'd fallen in love with in college, though now silver threads wove through his dark hair and worry lines had etched themselves around his eyes. "Morning, beautiful," he said, kissing her cheek absently while scrolling through emails on his phone. "I'll probably be late tonight. The Morrison case is going to trial next week, and we're nowhere near ready." Sarah nodded, swallowing the disappointment that had become as familiar as her morning coffee. "Of course, I'll handle dinner." "You're amazing," David murmured, still not looking up from his screen. "I don't know how you manage everything." The words should have felt like praise, but instead, they landed like another expectation, Another reminder that managing everything was simply what she did, what was expected, what made her valuable. "Mom!" Emma's voice rose to near panic levels. The permission slip. Sarah abandoned her coffee and dove into the paper avalanche on the counter. Her hands moved quickly through the chaos. Bills, school newsletters, appointment reminders, grocery coupons that had expired weeks ago. Finally, her fingers closed around the familiar yellow sheet. "Found it!" she announced triumphantly, holding up the slightly wrinkled permission slip like a trophy. Emma's face broke into a relieved smile, and for a moment Sarah felt that familiar surge of maternal satisfaction. These small victories, the found permission slips, the successfully packed lunches, the scraped knees kissed better, they were supposed to be enough, weren't they? Jake grabbed a granola bar from the pantry and headed toward the door. "Mum, don't forget I need my cleats washed for Thursday's game." "Got it," Sarah called after him, mentally adding it to her ever-growing list. She turned back to Emma, who was now concerned about whether her science project volcano would erupt properly during the class demonstration. "Sweetheart, we tested it 3 times last night. It'll work perfectly," Sarah reassured her, smoothing down Emma's wild hair with gentle fingers. "Now go brush your teeth, the bus comes in 15 minutes. David finished his coffee and grabbed his leather briefcase from the counter. "Oh, I forgot to mention, my mother called last night. She wants to know if we can host Thanksgiving this year. Her arthritis is acting up again." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Hosting Thanksgiving meant preparing for 15 people, dealing with David's judgmental sister Patricia, and managing family dynamics that could turn explosive without warning. It meant weeks of planning, shopping, cleaning, and cooking, all while maintaining her work commitments and the children's regular schedules. "When do you need to know?" she asked, proud of how level her voice sounded. "By the end of the week, I guess. I know it's a lot of work, but you're so good at this stuff." There it was again. The assumption that being good at something meant you should always be the one to do it, regardless of the cost to yourself. After David left and the children caught their respective buses, Sarah stood in her kitchen, surveying the aftermath of the morning routine. Dishes in the sink, coffee spilled on the counter, Emma's art supplies scattered across the breakfast bar from last night's volcano project. The silence felt both blessed and overwhelming. She grabbed her phone to check her schedule for the day, scrolling through the color-coded calendar that had become her life's operating system. Blue for work commitments, green for the kids' activities, red for household tasks, yellow for her own appointments, though those were increasingly rare. At 10 a.m., she had a video call with the Henderson account team. At noon, lunch with her college friend Jennifer, their first get-together in 3 months. At 2 p.m., a parent-teacher conference for Jake. At 4 p.m., grocery shopping. At 6 p.m., Emma's piano lesson. At 7 p.m., somehow magically produced dinner for a family who seemed to expect her to conjure meals from thin air. As she loaded the dishwasher, Sarah caught her reflection in the kitchen window. When had she started looking so tired? When had the laugh lines around her eyes deepened into something that looked more like exhaustion than joy? The doorbell rang, interrupting her moment of self-examination. Through the frosted glass, she could see a small elderly figure holding what appeared to be a covered dish. Sarah opened the door to find Maria Santos, the woman who had moved into the house next door 3 months ago. Maria was probably in her 70s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. She wore a simple floral dress and a hand-knitted cardigan that looked like it had stories to tell. "Good morning, dear," Maria said, her accent carrying the musical cadence of her native Guatemala. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I made too much rice pudding yesterday, and I thought perhaps your family might enjoy some." Sarah accepted the ceramic dish gratefully, touched by the unexpected kindness. "That's so thoughtful of you, Maria. Thank you. You look tired, mija," Maria observed gently, using the Spanish endearment that somehow didn't feel invasive coming from her. "Are you taking care of yourself?" The simple question hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. When was the last time someone had asked about her well-being without expecting her to brush it off with a cheerful, "I'm fine"? "Oh, you know how it is," Sarah said, falling back on her practiced response. "Just the usual morning chaos with kids." Maria's eyes crinkled with understanding. "May I come in for a moment? I promise I won't keep you long." Sarah hesitated. She had work to do, preparations for the Henderson presentation, a house that needed cleaning before Jennifer arrived for lunch. But something in Maria's gentle presence made her step aside and gesture toward the kitchen. "Of course, can I offer you some coffee?" "That would be lovely." As Sarah prepared fresh coffee, Maria settled at the breakfast bar, her eyes taking in the organized chaos of the kitchen. She didn't comment on the scattered papers or the remnants of the morning rush. Instead, she simply sat quietly, radiating a calm that Sarah hadn't realized she was desperately craving. "You have beautiful children," Maria said, nodding toward the refrigerator covered in school photos, artwork, and achievement certificates. "I see them playing in the yard sometimes. They laugh a lot." "They're good kids," Sarah agreed, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Busy but good. And you, do you laugh a lot?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She set down the coffee pot, considering. When was the last time she had laughed? Really laughed, not the polite chuckles she offered at PTA meetings, or the patient smiles she gave when David told the same work stories at dinner parties. I guess I don't think about it much," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. Maria accepted her coffee with a grateful nod. "In Guatemala, we have a saying, el río que no se mueve, se vuelve pantano. The river that doesn't move becomes a swamp." Sarah sat across from her, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I'm not sure I understand. Sometimes, when we are so busy taking care of everyone else, we forget to keep flowing," Maria explained, her voice gentle but direct. "We become stagnant, like a swamp. We lose ourselves in the service of others." The words resonated in Sarah's chest like a bell being struck. She thought about her days, how they had become an endless loop of other people's needs and schedules. When had she last done something just for herself, just because it brought her joy? "I don't know if I remember how to flow anymore," Sarah found herself saying, then immediately felt embarrassed by the admission. Maria reached across the counter and patted Sarah's hand with surprising warmth. "The river remembers, Mika. It always remembers. Sometimes it just needs permission to move again." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the October morning light streaming through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny possibilities in the air. "I should let you get to your day," Maria said, finishing her coffee and standing. "But Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I want you to know that if you ever need someone to talk to or just to sit quietly with, my door is always open." After Maria left, Sarah stood in her kitchen holding the empty coffee mug, feeling something shift inside her chest. It was small, barely perceptible, like the first crack in ice beginning to thaw. But it was there, a tiny recognition that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than the endless cycle of service she had trapped herself in. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "So excited for lunch. It's been too long. Hope you're doing well. You seemed stressed in your last few texts." Sarah stared at the message, wondering what Jennifer had picked up on that she herself hadn't fully acknowledged. Was her exhaustion so obvious that it bled through even her carefully crafted text messages? She glanced at the clock, 9:15 a.m. She had 45 minutes before her work call. Instead of diving into her presentation prep or tackling the mountain of laundry upstairs, she found herself standing still in her kitchen, really looking at her surroundings for the first time in months. The walls were painted a warm yellow she had chosen 5 years ago because it reminded her of sunshine. Family photos covered the refrigerator, documenting birthday parties, school plays, family vacations, all the moments she had orchestrated and organized but rarely fully experienced because she was too busy making sure everyone else was happy. On the windowsill sat a small succulent plant Emma had given her for Mother's Day, barely alive, despite Sarah's sporadic attention. Even her plants were suffering from her inability to nurture anything that wasn't demanding immediate attention. The Henderson presentation could wait another 10 minutes. Sarah walked to the windowsill, carefully lifted the struggling succulent, and carried it to the kitchen sink. As she gently watered the plant, she found herself thinking about Maria's words, about rivers and swamps, about the difference between moving and being moved by life. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to flow again. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. Jennifer arrived at Café Luna precisely at noon, her auburn hair perfectly styled and her smile bright with the confidence of someone whose biggest decision that morning had been which designer handbag to carry. She hugged Sarah warmly, her expensive perfume a sharp contrast to the simple vanilla lotion Sarah had hurriedly applied after her Henderson presentation call. "You look great," Jennifer lied smoothly, though her eyes lingered on the dark circles under Sarah's makeup. "I love what you've done with your hair." Sarah touched her ponytail self-consciously. She'd meant to make an appointment with her stylist weeks ago, but between Jake's basketball schedule and Emma's science fair project, It had never happened. Now her dark brown hair hung limply past her shoulders, showing grey roots she kept meaning to touch up. "Thanks," Sarah said, settling into their booth by the window. Outside, downtown Millbrook buzzed with its usual midday energy. Young mothers pushing expensive strollers, retirees meeting for coffee, business people grabbing quick lunches between meetings. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going. "So tell me everything," Jennifer said, diving into her salad with the enthusiasm of someone who actually enjoyed eating kale. "How's work? How's David, the kids?" Sarah launched into her practiced update. Emma was excelling in 3rd grade. Jake was discovering a talent for basketball. David's law practice was busier than ever. Her marketing consulting was going well. The words came automatically, like reciting a well-rehearsed script. "And how are you?" Jennifer asked, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Really, how are you?" It was the second time in one day someone had asked that question with genuine concern, and Sarah felt that same unexpected tightness in her chest. "I'm fine," she started, then stopped. Maria's words from the morning echoed in her mind. "The river that doesn't move becomes a swamp." Jennifer waited, her blue eyes patient and knowing. They had been friends since their sophomore year at UConn, had been each other's bridesmaids, had supported each other through the early years of marriage and career building. If anyone would understand, it would be Jen. "Actually," Sarah said slowly, "I don't think I am fine. I think I might be drowning, and I don't know how to stop." Jennifer set down her fork, giving Sarah her full attention. "Tell me." The words came in a rush, like water bursting through a dam. Sarah found herself describing the relentless schedule, the guilt that followed her everywhere, the feeling that she was disappearing piece by piece into the roles she played: mother, wife, daughter-in-law, volunteer, professional, household manager. "I love my family," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love them so much it hurts sometimes, but I don't remember who I am outside of taking care of them. When did that happen? When did I become just a supporting character in my own life?" Jennifer reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Oh, honey, I had no idea things were this hard." "I didn't either, really. It happened so gradually, like gaining weight. You don't notice it day by day until suddenly none of your clothes fit anymore." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Except instead of clothes, it's my life that doesn't fit anymore. What does David say when you talk to him about this?" Sarah stared down at her untouched soup. "I haven't. He's so busy with the Morrison case, and when he gets home, he's exhausted. Besides, what am I supposed to say? Honey, I'm unhappy, even though I have everything I thought I wanted. He'd think I was being ungrateful. Would he? Or is that what you're afraid you'd be?" The question hit home. Sarah had been raised by parents who measured worth through service to others, who taught her that good women sacrificed without complaint, that happiness was selfish when others needed you. "My new neighbor said something interesting this morning," Sarah said, changing the subject slightly. "She's this older woman from Guatemala, and she has this way of seeing things. She said I looked tired and asked if I was taking care of myself." Smart woman. "Are you?" Sarah considered this. When was the last time she'd done something purely for her own enjoyment? She used to love reading novels, but now she only read parenting articles and work-related materials. She used to paint watercolors as a hobby, but the art supplies had been packed away years ago to make room for the children's toys. She used to take long baths and listen to music, but now showers were rushed affairs squeezed between other obligations. "I don't even know what taking care of myself would look like anymore," Sarah admitted. Jennifer leaned forward. "Remember in college how we used to walk around campus at night just talking about everything and nothing? Remember how we'd spend hours at that little bookstore on Main Street, reading poetry and drinking terrible coffee?" Sarah smiled at the memory. "You bought that collection of Maya Angelou poems, and we sat on your dorm room floor, reading them out loud. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," Jennifer quoted softly. "You loved that line. You said someday you wanted to write stories that mattered to people." The memory hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had wanted to write. She had majored in English literature with dreams of crafting narratives that would touch lives, change perspectives, matter in some small way to the world. When had she stopped believing that dream was possible? "That was a long time ago," Sarah said. "Was it? Or did you just convince yourself it was impossible because it seemed selfish to pursue something that was just for you?" They finished lunch talking about lighter things, Jennifer's latest work project, mutual friends from college, plans for the holidays. But the conversation had shifted something fundamental inside Sarah, like furniture being rearranged in a room she thought she knew by heart. At 2 p.m., Sarah sat in the familiar orange plastic chair outside Jake's 6th grade classroom, waiting for his teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, to call her in for their conference. The elementary school hallways smelled like disinfectant and childhood dreams, walls covered with artwork that proclaimed the limitless possibilities of young minds. Other parents sat nearby, scrolling through phones or reviewing notes about their children's progress. Sarah recognized most of them from school events. The perfectly put-together mothers who seemed to have parenting figured out. The working fathers who showed up looking slightly lost but trying their best. The blend of families that made up their community. "Mrs. Mitchell?" Ms. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, a young woman with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who understood that 12-year-olds were complex creatures navigating impossible emotional terrain. Jake's classroom was bright and welcoming, student work displayed on bulletin boards, motivational posters, encouraging growth mindsets and kindness. Sarah settled into a tiny plastic chair that made her feel like a giant. "Jake is a wonderful student," Ms. Rodriguez began, opening a folder thick with work samples and assessments. "He's creative, thoughtful, and shows real leadership potential." Sarah felt the familiar surge of pride that came with hearing good things about her children. "We're so proud of him." "However," Ms. Rodriguez continued gently, "I've noticed some changes lately. He seems more withdrawn, less engaged in class discussions. His work is still excellent, but he seems worried about something. Has anything changed at home?" The question caught Sarah off guard. Jake had seemed fine to her, moody sometimes, but that was normal for his age. Had she been so focused on managing the logistics of their lives that she'd missed signs her son was struggling? "Not that I can think of," Sarah said slowly. "His father has been working longer hours lately, but that's not unusual." Ms. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes children pick up on stress in the household, even when we think we're hiding it well. They're remarkably perceptive." Sarah's stomach tightened. Had her own unhappiness been affecting Jake without her realizing it? The thought that her struggles might be hurting her children was almost unbearable. "What can I do?" Sarah asked. "Maybe just some one-on-one time. Something fun that you both enjoy. Sometimes kids just need to know they have their parents' full attention, that they're not competing with work or household tasks or other obligations." After the conference, Sarah sat in her car in the school parking lot, engine running but going nowhere. She thought about Jake at breakfast that morning, how he'd seemed to want to tell her something about his friend Tyler, but she'd been too distracted by Emma's permission slip crisis to really listen. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Meeting running late. Won't be home for dinner. Sorry." Another evening of managing bedtime routines alone. Another dinner where she'd sit with the kids, but spend most of the meal reminding them to eat their vegetables and finish their homework instead of actually talking with them. She drove to the grocery store on autopilot, navigating the aisles with her usual efficiency. Milk, bread, ingredients for tomorrow night's dinner, snacks for the kids' lunches. She moved through the store like a robot executing a program, her mind elsewhere. In the cereal aisle, she ran into Patricia Henderson, no relation to her work client, just one of those unfortunate coincidences of small-town life. Patricia was everything Sarah sometimes feared she was becoming. Perfectly organized, impeccably dressed, and absolutely exhausting to be around. "Sarah, how lovely to see you," Patricia said, her voice carrying the particular enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed running into people at the grocery store. "I heard through the PTA grapevine that you might be hosting Thanksgiving this year. How exciting." Sarah's heart sank. She hadn't even decided yet, and already the news was spreading through the community network of mothers who somehow managed to know everyone else's business. "Nothing's confirmed yet," Sarah said carefully. "Oh, but you simply must. You have such a gift for entertaining. Remember Emma's birthday party last year? Pinterest perfect, absolutely Pinterest perfect. I don't know how you do it all." There it was again. That assumption that being good at something meant you should always do it, regardless of the personal cost. "We'll see," Sarah said, grabbing a box of Jake's favorite cereal and moving toward the checkout lanes. But Patricia followed, apparently not finished with the conversation. "You know, I was just saying to Margaret Powell at yoga this morning, that's Margaret from the library committee, not Margaret from book club. Anyway, I was saying how lucky David is to have such a capable wife. Not every man gets to focus on his career knowing that everything at home is handled so beautifully." Each word felt like a small stone being placed on Sarah's chest. Capable, lucky David, everything handled beautifully. The praise that was supposed to feel good, but instead felt like chains being locked into place. At home, she unpacked groceries while Emma practiced piano in the living room. The sound of Für Elise drifted through the house, Emma's small fingers working through the familiar melody with the concentration of someone determined to get it right. Sarah found herself pausing to really listen. When had Emma gotten so good? How many practice sessions had Sarah supervised while mentally planning dinner or folding laundry or returning work emails? How much of her children's growth was she missing because she was physically present but mentally absent? Jake burst through the front door at 4:30, his backpack hitting the floor with the particular thud of someone who considered homework a personal burden. "Hey, Mom," he called, heading straight for the kitchen and the after-school snack she always had waiting. "Tyler's mom said she can drive me to practice tomorrow if you can pick us up after." Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him. Miss Rodriguez was right. There was something different in his eyes, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. He was still her cheerful, athletic boy, but underneath, she could see worry creeping in around the edges. "Actually," Sarah said, making a decision that surprised them both, "how about I drive you to practice tomorrow and we stop for ice cream afterward? Just the two of us." Jake's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Really? What about Emma? Emma can come too if she wants. Or we can do something special just for us. What do you think?" "That would be awesome, Mom. Can we go to that place with the weird flavors? The one with the bacon ice cream?" Sarah laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in weeks. "Yes, we can go to the weird ice cream place." As Jake headed upstairs to start his homework, Sarah realized that this small decision to prioritize connection over efficiency felt revolutionary. She wasn't solving the bigger questions about her life, but she was taking one small step toward flowing instead of stagnating. That evening, after dinner and homework and the usual bedtime negotiations, Sarah sat on Emma's bed, reading the chapter of Charlotte's Web they'd been working through together. Emma curled against her side, smelling like children's shampoo and the faint sweetness of the toothpaste she sometimes forgot to spit out completely. "Mom?" Emma said softly, as Sarah closed the book. "Yes, sweetheart. Are you sad about something?" The question stopped Sarah's heart. "Why would you ask that, honey?" Emma's brown eyes were serious, wise beyond her 8 years. "You smile a lot, but your eyes don't smile with your mouth anymore. Like when you're pretending to be happy, but you're really not." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. If even Emma could see through her carefully maintained facade, how long had she been fooling herself that she was holding everything together? "Sometimes grown-ups go through periods where they're figuring things out," Sarah said carefully, smoothing Emma's dark hair away from her face. "It doesn't mean I'm not happy, it just means I'm thinking about some things." About what? How could she explain to an 8-year-old the complex web of choices and obligations that had led her to this moment of questioning everything? "About how to be the best mom and person I can be," Sarah said finally. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to most important matters. "You're already the best mom, but maybe you could be happier about it." Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah kissed the top of Emma's head, breathing in the sweet scent of her daughter's childhood that seemed to disappear a little more each day. "Maybe I could," Sarah agreed. "I love you, Emma. I love you too, Mom, even when your eyes are sad." After turning off Emma's light, Sarah stood in the hallway of her beautiful home, listening to the sounds of her family settling into sleep. David was still at the office. Jake was reading in his room, the soft glow of his lamp visible under his door. Emma was already drifting off, her breathing growing deep and even. This was everything she had wanted: a loving family, a comfortable home, children who felt safe and loved. So why did she feel like she was suffocating? Sarah walked downstairs and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at Maria's house next door. A warm light glowed in the front window, and she could see the older woman moving around her kitchen, probably preparing tea before bed. On impulse, Sarah grabbed her jacket and stepped onto the back porch. The October night was crisp and clear, stars visible despite the suburban light pollution. She thought about Maria's words from that morning, about rivers and swamps, about the choice between moving and stagnating. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what flowing might look like, not the dramatic life changes that scared her. She wasn't ready to blow up her carefully constructed world. But small changes, gentle shifts toward authenticity and joy. Maybe it could start with ice cream dates with Jake. Maybe it could start with really listening when Emma talked about her day. Maybe it could start with an honest conversation with David about the weight she'd been carrying alone. Maybe it could start with admitting that loving her family didn't require disappearing into their service, that taking care of herself wasn't selfish but necessary for everyone's well-being. Standing under the stars in her own backyard, Sarah felt that crack in the ice grow a little wider, letting in just enough light to see that change was possible. Chapter 3. The Art of Letting Go. The ice cream parlor buzzed with after-school energy, teenagers claiming corner booths and younger children pressing their faces against the display case, overwhelmed by choices. Jake had settled on a double scoop of maple bacon, while Sarah opted for simple vanilla, a choice that felt both safe and somehow symbolic of how she'd been living her life. "So," Sarah said, settling into their booth by the window, "tell me about Tyler. You two seem to be hanging out a lot lately." Jake's face lit up, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah saw her son without the guardedness Ms. Rodriguez had mentioned. "Tyler's awesome, Mum. He's really good at basketball, but he's also super funny, and he doesn't make fun of kids who aren't as good at sports, you know." Sarah nodded, spooning up vanilla ice cream that tasted better than it had any right to. "That says a lot about his character." "Yeah, and his parents are getting divorced." Jake said this casually, but Sarah caught the weight behind the words. "I'm sorry to hear that. That must be hard for him." Jake nodded, suddenly focused very intently on his ice cream. "He said his parents used to fight a lot, but now they're nicer to each other because they don't live together anymore. Isn't that weird?" Sarah's chest tightened. "Sometimes adults go through difficult times, honey. It doesn't mean they don't love each other or their children." Tyler said he was worried at first that it was his fault somehow, like maybe if he'd been better at keeping his room clean or gotten better grades, they would have stayed together. The conversation was heading into territory that made Sarah uncomfortable, but she forced herself to stay present, to really listen to what her son was trying to tell her. "What do you think about that?" she asked gently. Jake was quiet for a long moment, swirling his spoon through melting ice cream. "I think grown-ups make their own choices, and kids can't fix grown-up problems, even if they try really hard." The wisdom in his words hit Sarah like a gentle punch to the solar plexus. Her 12-year-old son understood something she had been struggling with, that you couldn't fix other people's problems by sacrificing yourself, that taking responsibility for everyone else's happiness was both impossible and unfair to everyone involved. "That's very wise, Jake." "Mum?" His voice was quieter now, more hesitant. "Are you and Dad okay?" The question she had been dreading, delivered with such innocent directness that she couldn't deflect it with her usual reassurances. "Why do you ask, sweetheart? You guys don't really talk anymore, not like Tyler's parents did before they decided to get divorced. They yelled a lot. You and Dad just don't talk. You organize stuff, and he works, but you don't sit together and laugh like you used to." Sarah set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly gone. How long had Jake been observing their marriage with such clarity? How long had he been worrying about things that should be far from a child's concerns? "Dad and I are going through a busy time right now," Sarah said carefully. "Sometimes when adults are stressed about work and responsibilities, they forget to make time for the fun parts of being together." "So you're not getting divorced?" "No, honey, we're not getting divorced. But I think maybe Dad and I need to remember how to be better friends to each other." Jake nodded solemnly. Tyler said his counselor told him that sometimes parents need to work on being happy with themselves before they can be happy with each other. Another profound observation from a child who shouldn't have to think about such things. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Jake's hand. "Tyler sounds like a very smart friend to have." "Yeah. And Mum? I think maybe you should work on being happy with yourself too. You always take care of everyone else, but who takes care of you?" The question echoed Maria's words from the morning before, and Sarah realized that her unhappiness was more visible than she'd thought. Even her children could see that she was drowning. "You know what?" Sarah said, making another impulsive decision. "You're absolutely right, and I think it's time I figured out how to do that." That evening, after homework was finished and dinner dishes were cleared, Sarah found herself standing in the hallway outside the spare bedroom that had become a catch-all storage space. Somewhere behind boxes of Christmas decorations and outgrown children's clothes were her art supplies, packed away 5 years ago, when Emma started kindergarten and life became too complicated for hobbies. David was still at the office, working late on the Morrison case. The children were settled with their evening routines, Jake reading in his room, Emma practicing piano scales with the methodical dedication of someone determined to master Für Elise before her next lesson. Sarah pushed open the door and flicked on the overhead light. The room looked like a monument to good intentions, boxes labeled in her careful handwriting, seasonal decorations waiting for their annual moment of relevance, exercise equipment that had been used enthusiastically for exactly 3 weeks 2 summers ago. She began moving boxes, searching for the one labeled Sarah's Art Supplies in the neat script she'd used back when she still believed she'd unpack them again soon. Behind the Halloween decorations, underneath a box of maternity clothes she'd saved just in case for years, after deciding their family was complete, she found it. The cardboard was slightly dented, dust collecting in the corners, but when Sarah lifted the lid, the familiar smell of paint and possibility wafted up. Watercolor tubes, brushes of various sizes, sketch pads with only a few pages used, canvases still wrapped in plastic. The tools of dreams she'd convinced herself were childish. She carried the box downstairs to the kitchen table, clearing away the day's detritus of school papers and work documents. As she unwrapped brushes and squeezed out small amounts of cerulean blue and cadmium yellow onto a paper plate, muscle memory began to return. Sarah had always loved watercolors for their unpredictability, the way colors bled into each other, creating effects you couldn't completely control. Tonight, that seemed perfect. Control had been her obsession for so long. Maybe it was time to embrace a little chaos. She started with simple washes of color, blues melting into greens, yellows bleeding into oranges. No specific subject in mind, just the pure joy of watching pigment dance across wet paper. Her shoulders began to relax for the first time in months. "Mom, what are you doing?" Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair damp from her bath, wearing pajamas decorated with tiny stars. "I'm painting, sweetheart. I used to do this a lot before you and Jake were born." Emma climbed onto the chair beside her, studying the abstract swirls of color with the serious attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. "It's beautiful. Can I try?" Sarah hesitated. She'd just reclaimed this small piece of herself. Did she really want to share it immediately? But looking at Emma's eager face, she realized that modeling joy might be just as important as experiencing it. "So of course, but we'll need to protect your pajamas." They covered Emma in one of David's old dress shirts, the sleeves rolled up multiple times, creating a makeshift smock that made Emma giggle. Sarah set up a second paper plate with fresh colors and handed Emma a brush. For the next hour they painted side by side in comfortable silence, broken only by Emma's occasional observations about how purple and yellow make brown, but it's a pretty brown, or the paint looks like clouds when it's wet. Sarah found herself painting without thinking, letting her hands remember rhythms her mind had forgotten. Colors flowed across the paper, like emotions finally given permission to express themselves. Deep blues of sadness she'd been carrying, bright yellows of hope she'd almost forgotten existed, gentle greens of growth and possibility. "This is really fun, Mom," Emma said, adding another layer of pink to what appeared to be becoming a sunset. "Why don't you do this anymore?" "I guess I convinced myself I didn't have time," Sarah admitted, "but you have time for lots of things. You have time for grocery shopping and cleaning and helping with homework. Those are things our family needs me to do." Emma considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "But don't you need you to do things too?" Another moment of clarity delivered by her 8-year-old daughter. Sarah looked at the painting taking shape in front of her, abstract but somehow expressing something essential about movement and change, about the difference between stagnation and flow. "Yes," Sarah said softly, "I think I do." Jake wandered down from his room around 9 o'clock, drawn by the unusual sight of his mother and sister, engaged in an activity that wasn't obviously productive. "Cool," he said, studying their work. "Emma, yours looks like a sunset over the ocean." Emma beamed with pride. "Mom's looks like feelings." Jake tilted his head, considering Sarah's painting with the unconscious wisdom that children brought to art appreciation. "Yeah, it does. Like happy and sad feelings mixed together." "Sometimes feelings are complicated," Sarah said. "Sometimes you can be grateful for your life and still wish some things were different. Like Tyler," Jake said, settling into a chair at the table. "He loves his parents, but he's also kind of relieved they're not fighting anymore." Sarah nodded, cleaning her brushes in a jar of water that had turned murky with dissolved pigments. "Exactly like that." At 10 o'clock, David finally came home to find his family gathered around the kitchen table, paint-stained and laughing, as Emma tried to paint a portrait of their cat, Whiskers, who kept moving every time she started a new whisker. "What's all this?" he asked, loosening his tie with the exhausted relief of someone whose day had been too long and too complicated. "Mom's teaching us to paint," Emma announced. "Look, I made a sunset." David studied Emma's painting with the careful attention he usually reserved for legal documents. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Very atmospheric. Sarah could hear the confusion in his voice. This wasn't part of their usual evening routine. By this time, the children should be in bed, the kitchen should be clean, and she should be preparing for the next day's obligations. I found my old art supplies, Sarah explained, suddenly feeling like she needed to justify this small rebellion against efficiency. That's great, honey, David said, but his eyes were already drifting toward the stack of case files he'd dropped on the counter. Morrison's team filed another motion today. I need to review it tonight. Of course, Sarah said, beginning to clean up the art supplies with practiced efficiency. The moment of magic was over. Reality was reasserting itself, but as she tucked Emma into bed 20 minutes later, her daughter surprised her again. Mom, can we paint tomorrow too? We'll see, sweetheart. Tomorrow's pretty busy. But you said you need you to do things too. Painting is a thing you need you to do. Sarah sat on the edge of Emma's bed, struck once again by her daughter's ability to cut straight through adult complications to essential truths. You're right, Sarah said. Yes, we can paint tomorrow too. Emma's smile was radiant. Good. And maybe we can teach Dad how to paint feelings too. I think he has some sad feelings mixed up with his work feelings. Another observation that landed like a gentle blow to Sarah's chest. Even Emma could see what Sarah had been trying to ignore, that David was struggling too, perhaps in ways that neither of them knew how to address. After Emma fell asleep, Sarah returned to the kitchen to finish cleaning up. David sat at the table, law books and legal briefs spread around him like a fortress against the rest of the world. His reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked older than his 36 years, worn down by the relentless pressure of a career that demanded everything and gave back only money and status. David, Sarah said quietly, not wanting to interrupt if he was deeply focused. He looked up, his eyes taking a moment to focus on her instead of the documents. The kids asked some interesting questions tonight. Thus, what kind of questions? Sarah settled into the chair across from him, the same chair where Maria had sat just yesterday morning, offering wisdom about rivers and swamps. Jake asked if we were okay, if we were getting divorced. David's attention sharpened immediately. What did you tell him? I told him we weren't getting divorced, but that maybe we needed to remember how to be better friends to each other. David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently straightening the edges of his papers. Do you think we're not okay? It was such a loaded question, carrying the weight of 15 years of marriage, 2 children, a mortgage, shared dreams that had somehow become separate obligations. I think we're both drowning, Sarah said carefully. I think we've become so focused on managing our responsibilities that we've forgotten how to enjoy each other. The Morrison case will be over soon, David said. Things will calm down after that. Will they? There's always another case, another crisis at work, just like there's always another school project or household emergency or family obligation for me to manage. David set down his pen, giving her his full attention for the first time in weeks. Are you unhappy, Sarah? The question hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable, in a way their conversations hadn't been in months. I'm lost, Sarah admitted. I love our life, I love our family, but I don't know who I am anymore outside of taking care of everyone else. And I think our kids are starting to notice. What can I do? I mean, I know I've been working too much, but this case, it's not about the case, David, it's about us. When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about logistics? When was the last time we laughed together? When was the last time we talked about dreams instead of just schedules? David removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes. In the kitchen light, she could see the exhaustion etched in his features, the way stress had carved lines around his mouth and eyes. I don't remember, he said quietly. I feel like I'm running as fast as I can just to keep everything from falling apart. Me too, Sarah said, but maybe we're running in the wrong direction. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken dissatisfaction settling between them. It wasn't anger or resentment exactly, but something sadder, the recognition that they had drifted apart while trying to build a life together. I painted tonight, Sarah said suddenly. For the first time in 5 years I painted, and it felt like coming back to life. David studied her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time in months. You look different. Younger maybe? Or just more like yourself? Emma said I have time for grocery shopping and cleaning and homework help, but don't I need me to do things too? David smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks. Smart kid. They both are. Maybe smarter than their parents sometimes. What do we do, Sarah? How do we fix this? Sarah thought about Maria's words, about rivers and flowing, about the difference between moving through life and being moved by it. Maybe we start small, she said. Maybe we start by remembering that we're more than just the roles we play. Maybe we start by making time for the things that make us feel like ourselves, like painting, and maybe like remembering why we fell in love with each other in the first place. David reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers warm and familiar, despite the distance that had grown between them. "I fell in love with you because you saw beauty in everything," he said quietly. "You used to point out interesting cloud formations and stop to watch street musicians and get excited about perfect autumn leaves. You made ordinary moments feel magical." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "I fell in love with you because you believed in justice and fairness and making the world better. You used to talk for hours about the cases you wanted to take, the people you wanted to help. When did we stop talking about those things? When life got complicated, I guess. When we got so busy managing everything that we forgot to actually live." David squeezed her hand. "So what do we do now?" "Now, we try to remember. We try to find our way back to the people we were when we chose each other. It wasn't a complete solution. There were still mortgages to pay and cases to win and children to raise and households to manage. But it was a beginning, a recognition that their marriage deserved more than the scraps of attention left over after everything else was handled." "I'm scared," David admitted. "What if we've drifted too far apart? What if we can't find our way back?" Sarah thought about the painting upstairs, still drying on the kitchen counter, abstract swirls of color that somehow captured the complexity of change, the beauty of uncertainty, the possibility of transformation. "Then we'll figure out how to fall in love with who we're becoming," she said. "But I don't think we have to. I think we just have to remember how to see each other clearly again." David closed his law books and stacked his papers neatly to one side. "Can I see your painting?" Together they climbed the stairs to look at the watercolor still drying on the counter. In the soft kitchen light, the blues and greens and yellows seemed to shimmer with possibility. "Emma was right," David said softly. "It does look like feelings, like hope and sadness and change all mixed together." "That's exactly what it is," Sarah said. As they stood side by side, looking at her first painting in 5 years, Sarah felt something shift between them. Not a dramatic transformation, but a gentle opening, like the first crack of ice beginning to thaw in spring. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Chapter 4. The River Remembers. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in Maria's cozy kitchen, learning to make pupusas while Emma and Jake worked on homework at the small wooden table by the window. The November afternoon light slanted through lace curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the warm air. "The masa needs to be just right," Maria explained, her weathered hands demonstrating the technique with the patience of someone who had taught this skill to daughters and granddaughters across generations. "Too wet and it falls apart. Too dry and it won't seal properly." Sarah pressed the cornflour mixture between her palms, forming a small bowl to hold the filling of cheese and beans. Her technique was still clumsy, but Maria never corrected her directly, simply showed her again with gentle movements that spoke of decades of practice. "In Guatemala, making pupusas was always a community activity," Maria continued, adding cheese to her own perfectly formed disc. "The women would gather in the kitchen, talking and laughing while their hands worked. The food was important, yes, but the connection was what nourished us." Sarah nodded, understanding flowing through her like recognition. This was what she had been missing. Not just time for herself, but connection to something larger, to traditions and wisdom passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. The past 3 weeks had been a study in small revolutions. After her conversation with David in the kitchen, they had begun making tiny changes to their routine. David came home early on Wednesdays, and they cooked dinner together while the children did homework. Saturday mornings became painting time, with all 4 of them gathered around the kitchen table creating art that ranged from Emma's increasingly sophisticated landscapes to Jake's abstract expressions of whatever music he'd been listening to that week. David surprised them all by revealing a hidden talent for detailed pen and ink drawings, creating intricate cityscapes during their family art sessions. "I used to doodle during boring classes in law school," he'd admitted sheepishly, showing them a precise rendering of their house. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed it." The changes weren't dramatic. Their lives were still busy, still full of obligations and schedules and the endless logistics of family life. But something fundamental had shifted, like a river finding a new channel after years of stagnation. "Mom, I need help with this math problem," Jake called from the table, his voice carrying the particular frustration of a 12-year-old wrestling with pre-algebra. "In a moment, honey," Sarah replied, focused on sealing the edges of her pupusa without letting the filling escape. A month ago, she would have immediately abandoned what she was doing to help with homework. Now she was learning the radical act of finishing her own tasks first. "I can help," Emma offered, moving to look over her brother's shoulder. "We learned about fractions like this last year." Sarah and Maria exchanged amused glances as Emma patiently explained the problem to Jake, using the same tone of gentle instruction that Sarah used when helping with homework. "Children learn more from what we do than what we say," Maria observed quietly. "Emma sees you learning something new, taking time for yourself, and she learns that it's normal to help others, while also pursuing your own interests." Sarah sealed her pupusa successfully and looked up to find Maria studying her with those knowing eyes that seemed to see everything. "You look different than you did a month ago, Mija. More present." Sarah considered this. She did feel more present, more aware of the texture of experiences, instead of just rushing through them. The previous weekend, she and David had driven to a farmer's market 2 towns over, leaving the children with David's parents, and spending the morning wandering among stalls of late-season apples and handmade crafts. They'd talked about everything and nothing, David's growing interest in taking more pro bono cases, Sarah's tentative idea of maybe writing again, their shared dream of someday traveling to places they'd only read about. It had felt like dating again, like discovering each other fresh instead of assuming they knew everything about their shared life. "I'm remembering how to flow instead of just manage," Sarah said, using Maria's metaphor from that first morning conversation. Maria smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of her eyes. "The river remembers its course even when it's been dammed for a long time. It just needs permission to move again." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of shaping masa and sealing pupusas, creating a meditative quality that Sarah had come to treasure. This weekly cooking lesson had become one of her favorite parts of the week, an hour where she learned something completely unrelated to her roles as mother, wife, or professional, something that was purely for the joy of knowing. "Mrs. Santos?" Emma's voice carried from the table. "Can you tell us about Guatemala? We're studying Central America in social studies, and Mrs. Peterson said we should interview people who have lived in other countries." Maria's face lit up with pleasure. She wiped her hands on her apron and joined the children at the table, settling into the chair that Sarah now thought of as Maria's place in their extended family. "What would you like to know, Pequeña?" Emma opened her notebook, pencil poised with the seriousness she brought to all academic endeavors. "What was it like when you were little? Did you always know you would come to America?" Maria's expression grew thoughtful, touched with the particular wistfulness that came with remembering a homeland left behind. "When I was your age, Emma, I lived in a small village in the mountains. My job every morning was to walk to the well for water, carrying a clay jug that my grandmother had made with her own hands." She began to describe her childhood, waking before dawn to help her mother grind corn for tortillas, walking miles to a one-room schoolhouse where one teacher taught children of all ages, evenings spent listening to her grandfather tell stories that had been passed down for generations. Jake looked up from his math homework, caught by the narrative despite himself. "Why did you leave?" "Sometimes life gives you choices that aren't really choices, mijo. My husband found work in a factory here, and we thought we would stay for just a few years, save money, and return home. But life has its own plans." Sarah continued working on the pupusas, listening to Maria's story with the part of her mind that had always been drawn to narratives, to the way people made sense of their experiences through telling. She thought about her old dream of writing stories that mattered, and realized that Maria was doing exactly that, sharing stories that preserved history, that connected past to present, that reminded them all of the courage it took to build a life in an unfamiliar place. "Do you miss Guatemala?" Emma asked softly. "Every day," Maria said without hesitation. "But I've learned that home isn't just a place. Home is the people you love, the traditions you carry with you, the ways you choose to make beauty in whatever place you find yourself." She gestured around her small kitchen, with its carefully tended herbs on the windowsill, the hand-embroidered dish towels that added color to the simple space, the family photos that told the story of a life lived across borders and decades. "This is home now too, especially when friends come to cook and children ask curious questions, and I remember that sharing stories is how we keep the best parts of our past alive." Sarah felt something click into place, a recognition that had been building for weeks. This was what had been missing from her life, Not just personal fulfillment, but connection to something larger than her immediate family's needs. Community, stories. The understanding that her own experiences might have value beyond their utility to others. "Maria," Sarah said suddenly, the idea forming as she spoke, "would you be interested in being interviewed for a local history project? I mean, officially. The Historical Society is always looking for oral histories from community members, and your story, it's important." Maria's eyes widened with surprise and pleasure. "You think my story would interest others? I think your story could help people understand what courage looks like, what it means to build a life with love and intention, even when circumstances are difficult." Emma looked up from her notes. "Mom, you could write it down? You're really good at writing." Sarah felt her heart skip. She hadn't told the children about her tentative thoughts of returning to writing, hadn't wanted to make promises she might not keep. But Emma's confidence in her abilities struck her as both touching and challenging. "What do you think, Maria? Would you be willing to work with me on recording your story?" Maria reached across the table and patted Sarah's hand with familiar warmth. "I think, Mija, that would be a way for both of us to remember what we're capable of." The pupusas sizzled on the griddle, filling the kitchen with the rich smell of corn and cheese, while outside the November wind rattled the windows with the promise of winter coming. But inside Maria's kitchen, surrounded by the warmth of new friendship and old stories, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future, curiosity about possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. That evening, after David came home early as had become their Wednesday tradition, the four of them gathered around their own kitchen table to eat Maria's pupusas and share the day's discoveries. Emma proudly presented her interview notes, reading Maria's descriptions of her childhood village with the dramatic flair of someone who understood the power of a good story. Jake announced that he'd figured out the math problems that had frustrated him earlier, and that Tyler's parents were doing better now that they'd learned how to live separately without fighting. David talked about a pro bono case he'd decided to take, a family facing immigration challenges, who reminded him why he'd gone to law school in the first place. And Sarah found herself describing her idea about recording Maria's oral history, the words tumbling out with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. "That's a wonderful idea," David said, his eyes bright with genuine interest. "Maria's story deserves to be preserved, and you're the perfect person to help her tell it." "But I haven't written anything in years," Sarah protested. "I don't know if I still remember how." "Mom," Emma said with 8-year-old certainty, "you write beautiful thank you notes and funny birthday cards and really good emails when teachers ask questions about school stuff. You know how to write. You just forgot you knew how." Another moment of wisdom from their children, who seemed to understand essential truths that adults had complicated beyond recognition. "Besides," Jake added, "Tyler's dad says the best way to remember how to do something is to start doing it, even if you're rusty at first." After dinner, while David helped the children with evening routines, Sarah sat in the living room with her laptop, staring at a blank document. She typed Maria Santos Oral History Project at the top, then sat back, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was considering. How did you capture a life in words? How did you honor someone's experiences while making them accessible to others? How did you write with authenticity about courage and loss and the complex beauty of building a home in a foreign place? David found her there an hour later, still staring at the mostly empty screen. "Stuck?" he asked gently, settling beside her on the couch. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "What if I can't do this? What if I'm not good enough to tell her story properly?" David was quiet for a moment, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Remember when Emma was learning to ride her bike? She kept saying she was too scared to try, that she'd fall and get hurt. And you told her that falling was part of learning, that everyone falls at first." "Right. And what did she say?" Sarah smiled at the memory. "But what if I fall and never get back up? And you said, then you'll have learned something important about yourself. But what if you get back up and discover you love riding bikes?" Sarah leaned against David's shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of shared history, of someone who knew her well enough to offer exactly the encouragement she needed. "What if I discover I love writing again?" she said softly. "Then you'll have found another piece of yourself. And even if you fall a few times learning to use those muscles again, you'll know you were brave enough to try." Sarah opened a new document and began typing. Not an outline or a plan, but simply her first impressions of Maria, the way her hands moved when she cooked, the musical cadence of her voice when she spoke about Guatemala, the quiet strength that radiated from her small frame. The words came slowly at first, then with gathering confidence. She wrote about their first meeting, about Maria's wisdom regarding rivers and swamps, about the way cooking together had become a form of meditation and connection. She wrote until her eyes grew heavy, until David fell asleep beside her on the couch and the house settled into the quiet rhythms of night. When she finally looked at the clock, she was surprised to see that 3 hours had passed. On the screen before her were nearly 2,000 words. Not perfect, not polished, but alive with possibility. For the first time in years, Sarah had lost herself in writing, had felt the particular joy of finding exactly the right word to capture a feeling, of shaping sentences that said what she meant them to say. She saved the document and closed the laptop, but the excitement remained, humming in her chest like electricity. Tomorrow she would call the Historical Society, would set up a formal interview schedule with Maria, would begin the process of learning how to be a writer again. As she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the hallway mirror. Emma had been right that first night weeks ago. Her eyes were different now. They matched her smile again, bright with the particular energy that came from remembering what it felt like to flow instead of stagnate. Upstairs, she checked on the children, as had become her ritual. Emma slept peacefully, her latest painting still drying on her desk, a watercolor of Maria's kitchen, complete with tiny figures gathered around the table. Jake's room glowed softly, with the reading light he was allowed to keep on for 30 minutes after official bedtime, his basketball trophies catching the warm illumination. These were her children, growing and changing and learning from everything she did, not just what she said. They were watching her remember how to pursue her own interests while still loving them completely. They were learning that adults could change and grow, that mothers were people with dreams and talents beyond their roles as caregivers. In her bedroom, David was already asleep, his reading glasses on the nightstand beside a book about constitutional law that he was reading for pleasure, not work. Their relationship was still a work in progress, but the foundation felt stronger now, built on renewed respect for each other as individuals rather than just partners in the complex logistics of family life. Sarah slipped into bed beside him, her mind still buzzing with ideas for Maria's story, with plans for their Saturday morning painting session, with the small but profound satisfaction of having spent the day exactly as she'd chosen to spend it. Through the bedroom window, she could see the lights still on in Maria's kitchen, where the older woman was probably preparing her evening tea and perhaps thinking about the story they would tell together. The river was flowing again, carrying Sarah toward possibilities she was only beginning to imagine, and for the first time in years, she was excited to see where it would take her. Outside, the November wind whispered through the bare branches of the maple tree, carrying the promise of winter and spring, of seasons changing and life continuing to unfold in ways both predictable and surprising. Sarah fell asleep to the sound of that wind, dreaming of stories yet to be told, of connections yet to be made, of the infinite possibilities that opened when someone finally gave themselves permission to flow. In the morning, she would wake early and write again. But tonight, she rested in the profound satisfaction of having remembered who she was beyond all the roles she played, of having chosen to honor both her love for her family and her need to nurture the unique gifts that made her distinctly herself. The confession was complete, not whispered in darkness or shared in shame, but lived openly, courageously, in the full light of day. She had learned that love was not about disappearing into service to others, but about becoming fully herself, so she could love with authenticity and joy. And in that kitchen tomorrow, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and the patient wisdom of someone who had traveled far from home to find it again, Sarah would continue writing the story of how an ordinary woman remembered how to live an extraordinary life, one small choice at a time. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and if my story touched your heart today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next confession. Give this video a like if it resonated with you, and share it with another woman who needs to know she's not alone. Together, our voices are stronger.